I still remember the sting of that evening as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. We were sitting in the living room, surrounded by family, the air heavy with chatter and the clinking of teacups. My daughter-in-law's laughter rang the loudest when she looked directly at me and said I was unwanted. The words fell like knives in front of relatives and neighbors, cutting deeper than any wound I'd ever known. The room erupted in chuckles, some awkward, some cruel, but all of them aimed at me, standing there like a shadow in my own house. I did not argue back, though my heart was burning. I sat quietly, my lips pressed tight, as if silence itself could hold together the pieces of my breaking dignity. They thought they had humiliated me, stripping away whatever respect I had left. But in that moment, when everyone saw an old man shrinking into silence, I felt something else take root inside me. A seed of resolve buried deep began to grow. They wanted me small, invisible, irrelevant. Instead, I vowed that day I would rise in a way none of them could ever imagine. Their words, "You'll never be rich, you're unwanted," became the fire that would push me beyond the corner they tried to shove me into. I did not need to answer their laughter in that room because I had already promised myself that one day I would answer them with deeds, not words. For so many years, I had lived my life for them, not for myself. When my son and his wife struggled to pay their bills, I worked extra shifts, picking up whatever jobs I could find, quietly handing over money so they could keep the lights on. When they wanted a bigger house, I dipped into the savings I had carefully set aside for my own dreams, telling myself that family came first. Every time they called, I answered, whether it was to fix something, lend them cash, or simply provide a shoulder for their endless complaints. My own desires, my own plans always took the backseat, tucked away like old photographs in a drawer that no one bothered to open. I thought sacrifice was the price of belonging, that by giving endlessly I would secure my place in their hearts. But instead of gratitude, I was met with dismissal, mockery, and whispers that I was nothing but a burden. They told others I was too weak to be successful, too naive to build anything meaningful, too old to matter. And yet every cruel word came from the very people whose lives I had helped hold together. That betrayal cut deeper than any financial wound because it wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity, about respect, about the simple human desire to be valued. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, my generosity for foolishness, and my patience for failure. But they were wrong. And before I tell you what happened next, let me pause to ask you quickly, where are you listening from right now? I'd truly love to know, because stories like these connect us across miles and experiences. And as I share mine, perhaps you will remember moments in your own life where loyalty was met with betrayal. That is the foundation of this journey, not revenge for money, but the fight to reclaim the dignity they thought they could strip away from me. It was supposed to be a simple family gathering, nothing more than an evening of food and conversation. Relatives filled the house, laughter echoed through the rooms, and for a while I allowed myself to believe that perhaps this time would be different, that perhaps I would be treated with respect. But I was wrong. The jokes started small, little remarks about how I had never amounted to much, and how I was still living like a dreamer at my age. At first, I ignored them, forcing a smile, sipping my tea, trying not to let the sting show on my face. But then my daughter-in-law, with her sharp tongue and unrelenting cruelty, decided to go further. She announced to everyone, including neighbors and distant relatives, that I was unwanted in my own family, a man with no achievements worth remembering. The room erupted in laughter, their voices blending into one cruel chorus, their eyes gleaming with mockery. I felt my hands tremble, not from fear, but from a fire that was slowly building inside me. Yet I chose silence. I sat there, head slightly lowered, lips pressed together, while they laughed at me as though I were nothing more than a punchline. What they didn't realize was that my silence was not surrender, it was strategy. In that moment, I made a vow, one that I buried deep inside my chest, a promise that I would rise, and when I did, they would not even see it coming. They thought they had crushed me, but what they had really done was awaken a part of me that had slept for far too long. They crossed a line that night, a line that could never be uncrossed. And while they mocked me openly, I quietly began to imagine what it would look like to turn that vow into action. What does determination look like when it stops being a thought and starts becoming a plan? That was the question I carried with me as the laughter rang in my ears long after the night had ended. Not long after that humiliating evening, I began to notice small cracks in the flawless image my family tried to project. At first, it came through whispers, conversations overheard at gatherings, hurried phone calls cut short when I entered the room, and nervous glances exchanged between relatives when bills were mentioned. Curious, I started listening more closely, piecing together fragments of their struggles. A missed payment here, an overdue loan there. My daughter-in-law, so quick to ridicule me, was quietly juggling credit card debts. My son, who once stood proudly as if untouchable, had been falling behind on his business loans. Even cousins and in-laws, the ones who laughed the loudest, were carrying mortgages they could barely afford. The arrogance they wore like armor was hiding something far more fragile: vulnerability. I didn't act immediately. Instead, I began to research, spending long hours in public offices scanning through property records, debt filings, and foreclosure notices. What I found confirmed my suspicions. Several members of my own family were drowning in financial quicksand. Their assets, the very things they flaunted in front of me, houses, cars, businesses, were tied up in obligations they could not maintain. It was a strange feeling, sitting there with the knowledge that the people who called me worthless were themselves standing on a foundation built on borrowed time. Then came the realization that changed everything. In this world, debts are not just burdens, they are commodities. They can be bought, transferred, and owned, often quietly and legally. And the people who hold those debts, they hold power. With every page I turned, every document I studied, I began to see a path opening before me. A lawful, silent path to reclaiming the respect that had been stolen from me. I did not need to shout back at them, nor beg for recognition. I could let the numbers speak for themselves. I began making discreet inquiries, careful not to reveal my intentions. I spoke with brokers, read about the process, and even tested the waters with small, unrelated purchases just to learn how the system worked. The more I understood, the clearer my purpose became. If they had laughed at me for being poor, then I would quietly become the one thing they feared most, not their equal, but their creditor. They would never see it coming, because no one imagines that the man they dismissed as unwanted is the same man studying the fine print of their lives. Their arrogance had blinded them to their own vulnerability, but I saw it clearly. And I knew it was only a matter of time before I would move from watching quietly on the sidelines to stepping directly into the game. Numbers don't lie, and soon, those very numbers would give me the leverage I needed to turn humiliation into authority. The first purchase felt like stepping across a threshold I had only dared to imagine in private. It was both terrifying and strangely calm, like pressing a finger to a wound to see if it will finally heal. I had spent months learning the language of debt, how accounts are packaged, who buys delinquent notes, what paperwork mattered and what didn't. I moved slowly and legally, forming a small LLC that existed on paper like many others, arranging the funds I could scrape together, and working with a broker who treated me with professional courtesy and no questions about motive. When the transfer was finalized, nothing cinematic occurred. No shouting, no triumphant reveal, only the quiet shuffle of administrative change. Signatures, stamps, and a new name listed where an old creditor once stood. A week later, a polite, business-like letter arrived at my cousin's house. It did not carry my handwriting or my voice. It came from the servicing office under the new company's name. Please find enclosed your updated account statement and available repayment options. It read in neutral type, the sort of language designed to sound helpful and procedural. I watched from a distance as the first ripple of confusion moved through family conversations. My cousin, who used to brag about being self-made while mocking my ambitions, held the letter in his hands and looked unsure, then angry, then embarrassed, as if a private truth had suddenly become public. He called his brother, then his wife, voice tight with irritation. He did not imagine me. He would never have pictured that the man he had told to sit in the corner could occupy a line in his ledger. That contrast, months of their loud, casual laughter against the brittle silence that the letter produced, felt almost cinematic to me, except there was nothing theatrical about it. The power of the moment was in its restraint. I did not send threatening emails or dramatic reveals. I did not stand at the door and watch them squirm. I let the legal paperwork speak for itself, because the law and the ledger carry an authority far sharper than any taunt I could offer. Still, I confess I felt a complicated wash of feelings. Vindication and a pulse of sorrow that my family had reached such a place. Quiet satisfaction and a tremor of guilt for the discomfort I'd caused. I knew then that I could either become the person who smashed lives for the thrill of payback, or the one who used leverage to demand accountability and force a reckoning that might lead to repair. I chose the latter. In practice, that meant my first correspondence was deliberately humane, clear options, a reasonable repayment plan offers for restructuring rather than threats of immediate repossession. I wanted to force reflection, not ruin, to make them confront consequences without collapsing under them. The shift was immediate and visible. The jokes at gatherings stopped, not from respect but from a new, careful attentiveness. My cousin no longer swaggered, his voice lowered when money came up. Invitations dwindled. Where once there had been bold, careless boasting, now there was furtive accounting and a brittle defensiveness. And as this unease grew among them, a different kind of change happened in me as well. The joy I felt at being right was tempered by recognition of the responsibility I had accepted. Owning a note meant I had influence over someone's future, and influence must be wielded with care. I spent long hours drafting fair terms, consulting with advisors to ensure every step was lawful and ethical, and preparing myself for the moment I would need to confront them with facts, not fury. If this part of the story hits a chord, if you've ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to protect you, please do me a favor. Like this video and subscribe so more people who have been through this kind of quiet injustice can hear what comes next. The first quiet purchase proved two things to me. One, that their bluster was built on brittle ground, and two, that change could come without spectacle through patience and precise action. The ledger had shifted and with it came leverage, but I kept my hand steady. I would use this chance to reclaim dignity for myself, and if possible, to teach those who had once humiliated me how fragile the armor of arrogance really is. After the quiet success of that first purchase, something inside me shifted from curiosity to commitment. What began as a test became a strategy, and strategy demands scale. I didn't rush or celebrate. I methodically expanded my holdings, bidding on packages that included auto loans, small business notes, and finally, partial interests in mortgages tied to relatives I'd known my whole life. Each acquisition felt like placing a single, careful stone in a foundation I was building, and with every added note, the ground beneath their swagger grew a little less stable. I knew the numbers, I knew the paperwork, and I respected the legal framework that made this possible. I stayed scrupulous about contracts, transparent in my own books, and patient in my pace, because the last thing I wanted was to be undone by a technicality or the appearance of impropriety. Still, it was risky, far riskier than anyone who had laughed at me could imagine. I invested savings I had guarded for decades, negotiated small loans to bridge purchases, and even leaned on one or two anonymous partners who believed in the principle more than the profit. At night, I lay awake calculating worst-case scenarios. What if I lost the money and was left with nothing? What if relationships broke beyond repair? What if the shame of being the person who turned creditor on kin outweighed any vindication? But with risk came clarity. This was no longer about retribution. It was about restoring an equilibrium that had been skewed by public humiliation and private secrecy. The more notes I bought, the clearer the pattern became. Their supposed certainty, talk of secure mortgages, confident boasts about businesses, was often a veneer covering overdue notices, deferred payments, and payment plans kept alive by luck more than planning. Where they had once spoken loudly of stability in front of neighbors and friends, I now held tangible evidence of the fragility beneath their words. Their perceived security had been constructed on obligations they barely controlled. My hidden leverage was the patient accumulation of those obligations in a way that did not require spectacle to be effective. As the months passed, the atmosphere among family members subtly changed. Invitations to casual gatherings dwindled. The easy humor that had once centered on my failures evaporated into guarded conversations and sudden topic changes when finances came up. I watched my father's posture change. Less chest out, more measured, and noticed cousins who used to brag about purchases now flinch when a house or car was mentioned. The shift wasn't dramatic or noisy. It settled in like fog, altering the shape of interactions until everyone moved around it without saying its name. I continued to structure each purchase with care, offering realistic repayment options to those who were struggling, proposing forbearance where necessary, refusing to weaponize default unless it became the only path to accountability. I learned how to balance leverage with mercy, recognizing along the way that vindication that destroys leaves only emptiness, whereas leverage that leads to repair can restore dignity for both parties. Yet I would be lying if I said I felt no satisfaction. There were private moments when I allowed myself to feel the cold pleasure of watching arrogance quiet, of seeing faces that had mocked me now checking their own ledgers with unease. But those moments were fleeting, tempered by the weight of responsibility I had accepted. Every contract I signed meant I had influence over lives that, for better or worse, were entwined with mine. The tension built not only around the family but inside me. I was both the architect of change and its earliest critic, forever measuring whether my actions aligned with who I wanted to be. The community began to notice the change in a different way. Neighbors who had once shared jokes about my ambitions now paused before speaking, and small-town gossip turned cautious. A shopkeeper who used to make a passing joke about my corner sitting lingered when I entered his store and offered a curt nod instead. Respect, when earned this quietly, came without fanfare and often without words. Meanwhile, I kept my public persona calm and consistent, no gloating posts, no sudden displays of wealth, no public accusations, because the point of what I was doing was not to embarrass but to rebalance. The hidden leverage worked precisely because it was hidden. It allowed me to confront with facts rather than theatrics when the time came. Still, the pressure increased. Managing multiple notes required vigilance, legal counsel, and constant accounting. I hired a small, reputable firm to help manage the paperwork and consulted with financial advisors to ensure every step was defensible and ethical. The personal toll was real. There were nights of worry, moments of second-guessing, and karmic pangs at the thought of turning my family into clients rather than kin. But there was also a deepening conviction that dignity, once taken in public, had to be reclaimed in a way that could not be dismissed as selfishness or spite. As their unsteady confidence gave way to cautious calculations, I prepared for the next inevitable phase, the confrontation that would force them to reckon with the consequences of their earlier cruelty. I would not rush it. Patience had been my greatest asset so far. Yet I was ready, calm, deliberate, and acutely aware that the power I held was not merely financial, but moral. The power to demand honesty, to insist on accountability, and to offer a path forward that preserved what dignity remained for all of us. The day of the confrontation did not arrive suddenly. It was the slow culmination of every signature, every quiet acquisition, every night I lay awake rehearsing the conversation I knew would eventually come. I chose a Sunday afternoon when everyone was home, the kind of day that used to be filled with chatter, food, and laughter that somehow always left me feeling like an outsider. This time I walked in not as the dismissed relative, but as the one holding truths no one wanted spoken aloud. We gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where years earlier my daughter-in-law had dismissed me as unwanted, where my family had laughed off my ambitions, where I had once sat silently swallowing words I wanted to scream. The wooden surface between us seemed suddenly heavier, like it carried the weight of the years we had pretended civility while wounds festered beneath. I began simply, "We need to talk." Immediately, faces hardened. My brother leaned back with arms crossed, my daughter-in-law rolled her eyes, and one cousin muttered, "Here we go again." Their confidence was rehearsed, brittle but intact, until I slid the first folder across the table. Inside were neatly clipped documents, loan agreements, signed transfers, certified records. My brother snatched it up, scanning quickly, his smirk faltering. "What is this?" he asked sharply. I folded my hands calm. "That's your mortgage note. It's not with the bank anymore, it's with me." For a moment, silence hung heavy. My daughter-in-law laughed, too loud, dismissive. "You, don't be ridiculous, you couldn't even afford." I cut in, voice level but firm. "Check the signatures. The sale was legal, filed, and complete months ago. I am the creditor. Every payment you've been making has been flowing through my entity." The color drained from her face, though she tried to recover with a sneer. So what, you're spying on us now, playing banker? I shook my head. No spying, just business. And it isn't just this mortgage. I slid a second folder, then a third. One by one, the pile grew: car loans, business debts, credit lines. Each document was not an accusation, but a fact, stamped and signed by institutions they had trusted to keep their secrets. The table, once a place where I was ridiculed, had become the stage where the truth performed itself. The room erupted. My cousin slammed his palm on the table. "This is insane, you had no right." I met his anger with measured calm. "The law gave me every right. You were drowning in debts. I didn't force you to take them. I only stepped in when the banks were ready to sell." My brother's voice cracked, no longer booming but desperate. "Why would you do this to us? We're family." I leaned forward, holding his gaze. "Family? You mean the same family that laughed when I said I wanted independence? The same family that told me I was nothing in front of neighbors? I didn't do this to you, I did this for me, to reclaim my dignity." The words landed like stones. My daughter-in-law tried to rally, her tone shifting from rage to pleading. "Listen, we were wrong. Maybe we said things we shouldn't have, but you can't hold this over us. Please, we can fix this, can't we?" Her voice cracked on please, the first time I had heard her sound uncertain. I opened the final folder, laying out a timeline of payments, balances, and due dates. My voice remained steady. "This is not about holding it over you. These are your obligations. You chose them. I now own them. That means you answer to me." The shift in power was almost visible, like the tilt of a scale no one could deny. They had once spoken down to me with effortless superiority. Now they searched my face for mercy, their anger collapsing into fear, their dominance into dependency. My cousin whispered, almost to himself, "You really own it all." I nodded. "Not all. Just enough to make sure the next time you think about mocking someone, you remember what silence can do." The room fell quiet. For the first time in years, no one laughed. No one dismissed me. They sat trapped in a silence they could not twist into mockery. I didn't gloat, I didn't raise my voice. I simply gathered the folders into a neat stack and said, "I wanted you to see the truth with your own eyes. I'm not here to destroy you, but I will not be dismissed again. From this day forward, our relationship is not defined by ridicule. It is defined by respect or by contract. The choice is yours." I stood, leaving the silence to settle where jeers used to echo. They didn't follow me to the door. They didn't argue further. The weight of proof had pinned them in their seats. For years, they had owned the laughter. Now I own the tables. The very next week, whispers began to move faster than any of us anticipated. Word traveled through extended family circles like wildfire, carried by concerned neighbors, distant cousins, and old family friends who had always watched the dynamics quietly. What once had been a private humiliation for me, the laughter, the mocking, the dismissive comments, was now reversed in an almost poetic way. Suddenly, the very people who had belittled me found themselves at the center of scrutiny, their reputation quietly unraveling in front of others. Invitations that used to be sent without a thought were now scarce, as subtle judgments crept into conversations. "Have you heard about the payments?" Or, "I heard the notes aren't with the bank anymore." These murmurs carried weight, spreading the realization that the family members who had once strutted with confidence were now navigating the consequences of financial decisions they had never expected anyone else to control. I did not intervene. I didn't need to. I had learned the art of restraint, letting the truth speak in its own deliberate way. Every repayment notice that arrived, every balance adjustment made, served as a silent announcement of my quiet authority. People began to glance at me differently, not with ridicule, not with contempt, but with a hesitant respect that was almost tangible in the room. Neighbors who had once joined in the teasing were now careful with their words, cautious not to take sides, aware that the man they had dismissed was, in fact, the very one who held leverage over others. Social media surprisingly contributed to the ripple. Casual comments about my family's unexpected financial oversight began circulating in local groups and community pages. They were careful not to mention me directly, but the essence of the story, a powerful reversal of expectations, spread like a quiet storm. Relatives started receiving subtle inquiries from friends and colleagues. It became clear that my once laughing family members were facing a reckoning they could neither avoid nor charm their way out of. And yet I did not gloat. I never posted pictures of checks, never flaunted ownership or control. My satisfaction was private, measured, and deeply internal. The difference between then and now was stark. The same individuals who once mocked me publicly for my supposed failures were now recalibrating their image in the quiet internal spaces of judgment. The contrast was striking. Where laughter had once echoed in living rooms, silence now marked their public interactions. Where mocking comments had once defined gatherings, careful conversation and tempered voices now took their place. I watched from a distance, feeling a subtle vindication but also a surprising compassion. I knew the humiliation could have been devastating if wielded maliciously, but I chose to let the process unfold naturally. In local circles, my credibility began to rise quietly without boastful announcements. People approached me with questions about financial planning, discreetly asking for advice about managing debts and obligations. I had expected resentment or at least suspicion, but what emerged was cautious respect. My own standing shifted not because I had taken revenge, but because I had acted strategically, legally, and calmly. The narrative of ridicule that once dominated my life was replaced by a story of measured justice, one that unfolded without spectacle but with undeniable impact. The lesson was becoming clear to all who were paying attention. Public ridicule is fleeting while accountability lasts. They had mocked, belittled, and assumed that their laughter could remain unchallenged. I had not sought revenge, only balance. And as the news spread through the community, I observed silently how swiftly arrogance falls when met with silent, calculated truth. After the storm of ledgers, contracts, and quiet power plays had settled, I realized the story didn't have to end in ruin. I could have pushed further forced defaults or taken total control, but that wasn't the lesson I wanted to leave behind. Instead, I chose a path of measured fairness. I restructured repayment terms, offering reasonable schedules and interest adjustments, ensuring that no one would be destroyed, only held accountable. This approach allowed them to face consequences without collapsing under them, and it gave me the satisfaction of knowing that dignity could coexist with authority. At the same time, I turned my attention outward. I started a small, local financial literacy initiative, teaching community members the same principles I had relied upon: understanding debt, respecting obligations, and protecting personal assets. I wanted others to avoid the mistakes my family had made and to see that knowledge, patience, and discipline are more powerful than arrogance or mockery. It was a quiet project without fanfare but profoundly meaningful to me. In choosing growth over cruelty, I reclaimed not just respect from my family, but also my own self-respect. The cycle of revenge which had tempted me in earlier days was replaced by renewal, by building knowledge, awareness, and long-term stability. My family's humiliation had become an opportunity for transformation, both for them and for me. The laughter that once cut so sharply was gone, replaced by a sense of accountability and ultimately cautious cooperation. The contrast was clear. I had the power to destroy, but I chose to teach. I had leverage to humiliate, but I chose fairness. In this choice, my dignity remained intact, stronger than it had ever been, because true victory is not in crushing others, but in rising above cruelty while still achieving justice. Sitting back and reflecting on everything that had unfolded, I felt a mixture of emotions that were hard to untangle. I had been mocked, doubted, and publicly humiliated for years. The people who were supposed to support me had instead chosen ridicule, whispering behind my back and openly dismissing my dreams. And yet, after months of quiet action, strategic patience, and careful legal maneuvering, I found myself quietly vindicated. The ledger had shifted, the power balance had changed, and the respect that had once been withheld was now in some form restored. Not because I flaunted my success, but because I had acted deliberately, lawfully, and with restraint. Looking back, the journey wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't shout, I didn't flaunt, and I didn't gloat. Instead, I allowed the truth to speak for itself, letting the results of careful planning and steady action unfold naturally. And in doing so, I realized that the real victory was not in destroying those who doubted me, but in reclaiming my own dignity and, to some extent, teaching them the consequences of arrogance and neglect. My actions were guided not by anger, but by a desire for fairness, accountability, and quiet empowerment. But now I turn to you watching this story unfold. If you were in my place, mocked, dismissed, and left with no choice but to act, what would you do? Would you forgive those who wronged you, extending a hand to rebuild trust, or would you walk away, preserving your dignity while leaving the past behind? And why? There is no single correct answer. Some might choose forgiveness, seeing the value in repairing relationships and fostering growth. Others might walk away, understanding that sometimes the cost of remaining is too high. Each choice reflects not only how we respond to adversity, but also the values we hold, the lessons we want to carry forward, and the legacy we hope to leave behind. Before you answer, pause for a moment and think, what would integrity look like in your position? What would accountability look like? And what would dignity demand? These are the questions I wrestled with every step of the way, and they remain relevant to anyone facing betrayal, disrespect, or doubt. If this story resonates with you, if it stirs thoughts about justice, patience, and moral choices, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you forgive or walk away, and why? Your perspective matters, and the discussion we create together can help others navigate moments of quiet challenge, public humiliation, and personal vindication. The final contrast is clear. I chose restraint, lawfulness, and measured action. The choice now rests with you. Would you act with forgiveness or with self-preservation? How would you write your own story of quiet power and dignity?